Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotterman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. Welcome to the very first episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast, the show where we dive deep into the joys and struggles of Christian ministry in the heart of rural America. I'm your host, Garrett Heath, and whether you're tuning in from a small town church, your morning commute, or if you're lucky, a peaceful country porch, we're glad you're here. Now you might be wondering, what exactly makes rural ministry so unique? Is it the fact that church members might also be your neighbor, your car mechanic, and your line dance instructor? Or is it simply the quiet beauty of serving a community that values human connection more than Wi-Fi? Well, whatever it is, we're here to explore it all, the triumphs, the challenges, and the odd moments that make rural ministry like no other. In each episode, we'll talk with pastors, community leaders, and folks who've lived and worked in these small towns for generations. We'll talk about everything from the joys of baptizing in a river to the art of balancing faith with fixing fences. But we're also going to get real, because rural ministry isn't always idyllic. It's not just hay rides and potlucks. It's hard work, it's challenges that can feel isolating at times, and it's finding ways to share the hope of Christ in places that might not always understand your language or your GPS. So pull up a hay bale, grab your favorite coffee mug, and let's get into the heart of what it really means to do ministry in the rural corners of America. We're glad you're here for this ride, and we promise no cows were harmed in the making of this podcast. But all dad jokes aside, our real heart here is to have an honest conversation about the beauty and challenges of doing ministry and living a beautiful life in a rural context. As I said, my name's Garrett Heath. I'm the Director of Media and Communications at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. I was born and raised in a small town, Pennsylvania. I still live in small town, Pennsylvania with my wife, Autumn, and our, count 'em, 5 kids. My co-host and the real man you've all come here to see. Don't laugh. It's Charlie Cotterman. Charlie is it's a long list here. It's a real long list, but I'm just gonna somehow give him 4 bullet points. He's the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania, and he's married to his wife, Amy, and father of their only 4, I got them by 1, kids. So, yeah, Charlie, you have basically all the answers to our biggest questions, right?
Well, I'm now set up for failure because I definitely don't have that. And I do want everyone out there listening to know that Garrett has always beat me by 1 at everything. So, of course, there's one more child.
Pretty much everything. Yeah.
Unless he beat me by a lot more than 1.
Except you managed to get beyond this podcast where you're like, you have the upper hand.
Well,
I'm just like, some regular guy.
Well, as the producer, I think I
can figure out computers. So
you can edit it out. But in any event, yeah, thank you guys for joining today. I'm excited about this. And we are not old hats at this. This is my first podcast ever. And so welcome to this experience. You're a guinea pig, and so am I here. So it's going to be fun. But I think there's a lot to say about what's happening in rural places, what's happening in ministry, what's happening in towns. We're after holistic flourishing. We think God uses the church for that, but we think Christians in all kinds of fields do that. So, yeah, we're excited about what's going to happen. And I think this podcast can be really fun. So, yeah, we're going to talk about some hard things, but I hope this is going to be a fun ride.
It's going to be. I can tell.
We're going to do our best at least. So today we're going to talk about kind of the idea of what leads a person to choose rural ministry, or what makes rural ministry hard to choose sometimes. And I think there are some reasons that it is actually hard in many cases to think about rural ministry as a positive choice, especially if you're young in your ministry career. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons that's happening.
Obviously, like in our culture, we have this constant bigger is better mentality, and it seems to be across the board about everything. And somehow our, not just our careers and everything get wrapped up in that, but also church life and ministry. Yeah, I mean, where does that come from? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it, as my mentor would say, history is very important. There's a history here of kind of like an ever expanding frontier, and like, if build something bigger in the next stage. There's also kind of a way in which our society in the last 100 years has shifted. So in the 1920 census, for the first time, America was more urban than rural. And there was a shift in the way people thought about where big things were happening. And it wasn't this, there was no more frontier at that point. It had disappeared along with the buffalo. But what we had was, now the new frontier was really an urban landscape and an urban frontier, right? And so the big things were happening in cities. And so along the way, kind of this, and America had also been this kind of like numbers matter. So you think about big evangelists and the way they capture people's attention. So there were always some voices, the kind of small is beautiful voices. You think about, in this 1973, there was a book, Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. Like, there were always these kind of voices, the Wendell Berrys of years gone by, but they were always in the minority. And the easiest cultural voice to hear was always go big or go home. Do something big if you want to make your life matter.
Yeah, I think that's the voice that everybody seems to hear. Whatever book that was that you just mentioned, I'm not even familiar with it, right? Wendell Berry, I am. But I think these small voices, right, like in our broader culture, just get drowned out. Until you get a brilliant writer or something who somehow finds a voice to kind of cut through the noise.
That's right. And it's not just our broader culture. As you mentioned earlier, it's our church culture, right? So the American church is really good. I mean, I grew up in the 90s listening to contemporary Christian music. We are really good at hearing what's popular and making our own version. So the church has done that, not just in music, but like in everything. So if you're of a certain age, and I realize I'm dating myself here, but you remember Billy Graham, right? And so like everyone under the age of 30 is like, I don't remember Billy Graham. But if you're over 30, over 40, you definitely remember Billy Graham. And I can remember there was a time like when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, my parents definitely knew Billy Graham. And like, right, Billy Graham's known for these huge mass evangelism things, kind of called crusades. And I know when I was a kid, like if you were a young person feeling a call to ministry, your mom starts saying, maybe you'll be the next Billy Graham, right? Because bigger is better. And no one did it bigger than Billy Graham, right? So I think there's a way in which like that's been our model of like, what's a successful ministry look like? Well, it looks like crusades, like Billy Graham's 1 million person crusade in Korea. That's success. And then, once Billy Graham's kind of like fading out and getting to retirement age, you start having a new phenomenon, mega churches, right? Oh, now the new mark of success is to be the next Bill Hybels or Rick Warren or Mark Driscoll, right? And have these huge tens of thousand person churches. So I think there's a way in which that kind of bigger is better success seeped into everything, and don't get me wrong. We need people like Tim Keller saying, go to the city, do big things for God. I completely agree and am thankful for Tim Keller. And in some ways, Tim Keller pushed us out of the suburbs and into the cities, which is actually, I think, really great. But
it was still people oriented at its core, right? That's maybe a big distinction in this conversation, right? You have the endless chase of bigger and better that never really cares about people.
Or
right?
Maybe
it's more success oriented than people oriented, if that's somehow safe to say.
Maybe. Or I would say maybe some things don't scale, right? So a lot of these folks, I think, started out with great motivations, but dealing with success is a real thing. And some of these things are really hard to scale, the human side. And so that's what I would kind of say about a lot of that, is that it's just really hard to scale basic human things. But here's the thing. Small places didn't make the cut in any of those conversations. So if you were a promising young person from a small place who sensed the call to ministry, very few folks would communicate that like staying in your small town was like a strategic use of your life and calling. You know, it was go somewhere big, go to a city that seemed like a happening place. You know, if you want to really be a kingdom-minded person, you got to go somewhere big. To stay was almost like a compromise or failure. You know, and that's like the world that I grew up in, and that I encountered when I went to an urban seminary.
I mean, I think that's the world we all grew up in. I mean, you go to high school, it doesn't matter what your career choice was, right? If you were going to succeed, you know, to use that term, you had to get out of here, right? You had to get out of this place if you were going to make it, whatever that means. But I guess making it is just, I guess, taking part in the larger cultural story that we tell ourselves. But yeah, you're right. I can't remember anybody in my upbringing really encouraging me to like stay where I was, right? I had many people telling me to go somewhere and do this or that. But certainly nobody said, oh, the smartest thing you could do is stay right where you are.
That's right.
And build a life there, build a career there, build a family there, right? That's not a conversation that guidance counselors typically have with students and kids growing up. And it's not a conversation even in our churches, right? That we're having with kids. I mean, we're kind of happy that they leave for them, but we're also kind of sad that they're no longer part of our community.
That's right. There's this like kind of sense of mourning that sets in. You know, you have a promising person, you send them off, and then you're like, wow, I'm kind of like, we're going to miss that person. And I guess I never really had an imagination for how that person could invest right here. But I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. I kind of want to tell you a little bit about how God kind of brought me back to an appreciation for rural.
Yeah. What's your story? And I won't spoil it. I know your story.
Yeah, you lived part of this story alongside.
I've known you for a long time.
Yeah, that's right.
But your story speaks to this in a powerful way, I think.
Yeah, well, because of, you know, we all live in, every person, you know, you don't get to choose what era you live in, but you are influenced by the things in your era. And I think my story illustrates that, you know, I kind of like grew up in the 90s and this kind of like, you know, contemporary Christian music was big, worship stuff, and then the church growth movement was happening and mega churches. And then the early, 2000s, you have like Mark Driscoll, people like that, just blowing it out of the water in a good way. In some ways, like they're just like doing big stuff that everyone notices. And you think, that's, if I'm going to be a church planner, I'm going to be like that. You know, I'm going to do something like that. And so again, it's kind of like a product of your environment a little bit because of the cultural milieu. So I went to seminary in 2009. And, you know, at that point, still, like, if church planting was an urban and suburban phenomenon. And so the seminary I went to was in a city, and what they had to their credit, they had a church planting institute, which was awesome. But what they were talking about was urban church planting. And so I had a little bit of an entrepreneurial bent in me. And so I had always kind of been a starter of things and thought, you know, like, I kind of want to be a church planner. But the thing was, I didn't see anyone doing it in ways that spoke to the people I loved so much from my home and from the small places I grew up. I often say, if you've heard me talk, you'll hear me say this a lot, the people that peopled my childhood memories were not being addressed by this church planting movement. So I didn't plant a church. I went to seminary, and I had a professor who inspired me to go get a PhD. So my wife and I and our 1-year-old at the time and went to Charlottesville, Virginia, and I pursued a PhD. But about halfway through the program, God just started breaking my heart for home. This was like 2014. And we started praying. We started talking to friends. We started thinking and dreaming about planting a church about 20 minutes from the small town I grew up in a little town called Oil City, Pennsylvania. And so after 4 years in Charlottesville, we moved back. I tell people I had a half-finished dissertation, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 6-month-old. And a week later, we started a church in our living room in Oil City, Pennsylvania. And I would never change a thing. It was a beautiful season. But why we did that is that God started to like speak to me about small places that small places mattered. And I started to encounter a couple voices that could encourage me in that. And that's huge. Like, we have to have some people. So, I'm part of the Vineyard movement. And right about that time, the Vineyard had started this Small Town USA thing where they were looking to plant churches in towns of 10,000 and less. And I was like, oh my goodness, someone's out there. Because we kind of take it for granted now. It was really after the election of 2016 that people started thinking about rural ministry on a national level. If you look at the books that have been published in the evangelical world on rural ministry, it's all post 2016. Like, it's really been a recent last decade phenomenon that people have thought about this. So for me, it was a matter of kind of feeling this, finding some people that could speak into it, and then just jumping in, and God met us, and it's been such a good experience.
You said that there was voices that kind of helped you in this journey during that time too. Like, what were, off the top of your head, like what were some of these voices that helped to inspire your steps in the journey?
Yeah, so I mean, I honestly think that the primary ones were kind of like the Holy Spirit, God starting to just give me some compassion for home, and then the people I knew and the people I loved in the small places I grew up. And I thought, like, I really want to serve them. I really want to go back and live among them in this community and actually try to help this community flourish over the long haul. So that was kind of a personal voice from God and from these people that were part of my story. But then again, like the Vineyard, like having people in that movement talk about small town. And about the same time, Wheaton was rolling out their Rural Matters initiative and some of this. So there started to be, and one of the first books that came out was Small Town Jesus. I still like that book. It was just an encouragement to think about what's it look like to be an authentic kingdom presence in a small place. And then the books just started coming, and the blogs started coming, and the conversation started rolling. And so then you felt like, well, there aren't a lot of us, but we're part of this little community out there.
Sure. I mean, and to your first point there, I mean, I think this is maybe an underrated or overlooked kind of thing. But you're talking about the Holy Spirit, hearing His voice as you're moving through this journey. You talked about how you felt compassion or love for the people in your town. It seems to me, I know growing up, like that much louder voice of the culture was always telling you to like go and do these big things and the results will kind of follow. But somehow that, just listening to the Holy Spirit, like a surefire way, I guess, to know that it's the Holy Spirit is that He inspires love for real people in your heart, right? And I think that's something that within this conversation we can't forget about.
Yeah.
Right. Everything should probably come back to that point of contact, of simply loving the people around us that God's put in our lives, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's all ministry, or at least it should be, and we hope it is. And we keep coming back to the Lord and saying, let that be ministry for me, because any of us can lose it, right? But the one thing that's beautiful about small place ministry is because it's not seen as strategic. One of the beautiful things is that very few people are like, I'm going to make a big splash, so I'm going somewhere little. Like, you don't get this kind of like, I joke, there's a town a little ways away that there's a college there, and the churches all want to get kind of bigger and bigger. And the churches often are fighting with each other, or at least not super happy with each other. And I joke, where I am, the churches all know they need each other. There's not a lot of church fighting. Like, they're just like, we're in it together. And that's a beautiful thing about, I mean, of course we're humans, ego can enter anywhere, but in general, there's a way in which there's a goodness about the smallness, because it kind of purifies your motives a little bit. And it has a tendency to want to bring it back to love and compassion and human relationship. So I think that's something that's really cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously your story speaks to this conversation in a, very powerful way, but like, what are some like takeaways from, I guess, from your perspective, for somebody who's doesn't necessarily have a powerful story that's wrapped around this conversation, but like just looking to come into this conversation for themselves? Like, what are some takeaways that a normal guy like me can walk away with?
Right. I think that's a great question, because honestly, if we think like I have to have this powerful story of calling to a small place, like I think that's some people's story, but that's not everyone serving in a small place's story. Right. And so I think, how do we put this in a kind of, why does this matter? Why would I treat a rural church not just as a stepping stone to a bigger church, but as a really meaningful place to serve? And so I was thinking about, there's a handful of takeaways, and I'll just share them quickly. The first thing is, I think the most strategic thing you can do is follow the voice of God. We're all about these big strategies. And, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little put off by all the church planning stuff about have this huge strategy. I've been in some of those rooms, and it just, man, doesn't feel superhuman. The most strategic thing you can do as a human being created in the image of a living God is listen to the living God who made you. So if you are in a small place, like, you might have been born there for a reason. Like, maybe you shouldn't leave unless you hear God specifically say go. Or at least maybe you should be a little slow to leave, right? So Anthony of the Desert was giving kind of some words to young proteges. And it was basically, he said, to paraphrase, wherever you are, don't leave easily. And I think there's something to that. So if you're a person who grew up in a small place, like, maybe your first question should be like, I wonder why I'm here. Did God have a reason? And know that like strategic with God is not the same as strategic in our culture. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it is really hard, actually, to hear God's call to stay, to return to a small place, or to even go there. Maybe you're from a larger place. I assume that folks listening to this aren't all in small places. I assume we have folks listening to this in cities, in suburbs, all over, and maybe you're sensing, you've read Wendell Berry or something. You're like, man, maybe there's something about this small place. I think it's hard to hear that call today, because our culture works against it in any number of ways. I mean, celebrity culture, you don't go to a small place to become a celebrity. You actually don't go to a small place to build a platform. It's just not going to happen. Even if you're really good, there's just only 56,000 people in my entire county. That's not a very big platform if they all followed me on whatever platform I wanted. So really, we have to be intentional in the church and in our own lives about listening to the voice of God. That's one of the things we're trying to do at the Center for Rural Ministry, is actually make it slightly easier for young people and our students at Grove City College to maybe have room that if God is speaking to them, and we don't assume God's calling everyone rural, but if God's speaking to one person's heart, that maybe through our work, we can make it a little easier to hear it or know how to act on it.
I mean, to interject there too, I mean, if you don't mind, I think I think it would be powerful too if so many of our stories in this conversation are almost accidental. Like, people fall into rural places and then they happen to carve out a life. But like, wouldn't it be powerful if we chose that or had intention going in? We don't hear many stories like that today. So just my 2 cents there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that blend of accidental and chosen is actually how everyone's life works, and it's super beautiful. So it's like what God uses. So think about it. None of us choose our parents. None of us choose where we're born. It's all an accident of God's providence. And then from there, we get to make some choices. But you don't even get to choose always who you bump into, who you meet, things like that. So there is so much of like God's hand at work in our lives, and also our choosing to make decisions. So yeah, I
it's synergistic, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
a
cannot
synergy.
parse out the accident and choice from even my own story, let alone someone else's. But it's absolutely like the choosing part, the choosing to say yes to God really does matter.
And obviously, I think, right, the gospel narrative itself
Yeah.
kind of deals with this conversation to some extent, at least indirectly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the incarnation in general seems so unstrategic. The last thing I would say, at least in this, first podcast, because I could keep going, believe me, but I'm gonna refrain and just make one more point about why rural matters, and that's that Jesus showed that it did. Right. So the incarnation is this beautiful picture of God choosing small to do something big. Whether it's just the fact that Jesus grows up in small town Nazareth, or the fact that he starts with 12 kind of haphazard, at least in our view, disciples. Something small is like what the incarnation is, and yet it's enormously more than we can imagine. The impact is enormous. But I love that interaction in the first chapter of John's Gospel, right? In all small town pastors, I mean, this is like one of our texts, isn't it? There's Nathaniel and Philip, right? And Philip comes back and he says, you got to come meet this person, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathaniel, and every small town person's like, I get this, because the next town over, you don't understand. They're crazy. He's like, can anything good come from Nazareth? And I love the line. Philip says, come and see. Right? And that's what he does. He goes, he meets Jesus, and he says, oh my goodness, you are the King of Israel. You're the one we've been waiting for. That is what I hope to do with my life. What I hope the Center for Rural Ministry does. What I hope this podcast does is simply say, come and see. God is at work in small places. You just have to jump in to experience it. There's so much hope out there. Yeah, there are hard things, but there's so much hope. But to find it, you have to come and see what God's doing.
Yeah, it's an invitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. Well, thank you, Charlie. I think that's a wrap for this week's episode. We hope our conversation has provided you with encouragement, insight, and maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. If you found this podcast helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us grow. First, you can share this episode with a friend or colleague you think might benefit from it. Spreading the word is one of the best ways to help us grow. You can also leave us a review and a thoughtful comment on your favorite podcast platform. This helps more people discover our show. And lastly, leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. Thanks again for listening, and you can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.